Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're really getting into this book, The Laws of Human Nature. It's all about understanding people better
Yeah,
and
it's like, who isn't interested in that?
right. Everyone wants to figure that out.
Exactly. And this book, it's like it gets into these hidden forces that shape like our decisions, how we interact with each other.
Yeah.
Really thought-provoking stuff.
It really is. It dives right in this idea that we don't always know why we do the things we do.
Yeah.
Like there's this hidden part of ourselves kind of pulling the strings.
Okay, so the book kicks off with this idea that we humans don't always know why we do the things we do. Like there's this stranger within messing with our decisions.
Yeah.
You'll appreciate that. It even uses the analogy of a little demon. What do you think? Is that too extreme or does it ring true?
Well, it does sound a little extreme at first, right? A little demon inside.
Right.
But, think about it. Have you ever, done something, maybe under pressure, and then later thought, why did I do that?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Like
Okay.
that emotional self taking over. Right. And the book argues that ignoring this human nature thing, it's actually more dangerous now than ever before, especially with how technology amps everything up. It specifically mentions the dark side of social media and tribalism. It's easy to get swept up in those online echo chambers.
Absolutely. And, it's those reactive states. The book talks about anger, excitement, suspicion that make things even worse.
Oh, totally.
That really narrow our thinking.
Yeah.
Like that example of the 2008 housing crash, remember?
Yeah.
Fascinating. Everyone got so caught up in the hype, they just ignored all the warning signs.
Oh, and you'll love this. There's a whole section on cognitive biases. Those mental shortcuts that can lead to, totally flawed thinking? One that really resonated with me was conviction bias. But basically, the more passionately someone believes something, the more likely we are to think it's true, even if it's not.
Right. It's like the more we want something to be true,
Yeah,
the less likely we are to see the flaws in the logic.
exactly. We get blinded by our own beliefs.
Exactly. And that can be really dangerous.
It can be. It can be. And it's so hard to recognize in ourselves,
Absolutely. It's like we have these blind spots.
Yeah.
And we all have them.
It's true. It's true. So it's not just about recognizing these biases in others.
Right.
It's about really turning the mirror inward and saying,
Why am I doing this?
am I falling into these traps myself?
Exactly.
Because chances are,
Yeah.
we probably are.
To some degree, yeah, for sure.
To some degree, yeah, for sure. So how do we do that? How do we become more aware of those moments when we're maybe not thinking as clearly as we could be?
Well, that's where the book's exploration of reactive states comes in handy, I think. It breaks down irrationality into these three levels.
Okay.
And it starts with, honestly, just admitting that we often don't know why we do what we do.
So we're starting with that lack of self-awareness.
Exactly. It's not always some big, deep, complex reason. Sometimes it's just, well, I felt like it in the moment.
Right. And then we try to come up with some big explanation afterward to make it make sense.
Exactly. We create stories to justify our actions, even to ourselves.
Oh, I'm so guilty of that. I didn't mean it like that, when deep down maybe I kind of did.
Yeah, we all do it. It's human nature.
It is human nature, right? That's what the book's all about. So it's not just about those big life-altering decisions, but even those seemingly small, everyday choices.
Right, like what you have for breakfast or
Exactly.
what you choose to wear.
Yeah, why'd I wear this shirt today? I don't know. It just felt like it.
Exactly. It's like we're operating on autopilot a lot of the time. We react emotionally and then try to rationalize those actions later. And those rationalizations, they might not always line up with reality.
Okay, so we're often kind of clueless about our own motivations.
Yeah.
Where does that lead us? What's next?
Well, the book calls the next level high-grade irrationality. And this is where things get really interesting.
High-grade irrationality. I like that.
All right.
Has a nice ring to it.
Yeah. So this is when our emotions really take over.
Yeah.
Like those times we're under pressure facing a conflict or when we feel insecure.
Oh, I know those times. Definitely stressful situations.
Exactly. Our usual coping mechanisms, they kind of go out the window,
Yeah, yeah.
And remember those cognitive biases we talked about earlier? They become even stronger.
Oh, that makes sense. So it's like we're primed to make bad decisions when we're stressed out.
Exactly. The more emotional we are, the more likely we are to make decisions we might regret later on.
So how do we break free from that? Especially when these stakes are high.
Well, the book stresses how important it is to recognize the signs of these reactive states in ourselves.
Okay, so self-awareness.
Exactly.
Being mindful.
Are we getting defensive? Are we jumping to conclusions? Things like that.
Right.
If we can catch ourselves in those moments, we can start to create some space between our emotions and our actions.
That reminds me, we were talking about Pericles earlier, the Athenian general.
Yes,
He had a way of dealing with his emotions, right? Like a strategy.
he did. He
Yeah?
totally understood that he couldn't just ignore his emotions, especially during wartime when fear and anger were everywhere.
Right.
He knew how powerful they were. But instead of suppressing them, he actually developed these strategies to use them more effectively.
Oh, that's interesting. So what was his secret? How did he stay calm and collected in those high-pressure situations?
Well, book talks about how he created this almost theatrical persona for himself.
A persona, really.
Yeah. He was very deliberate in his movements, very careful with what he said, and he always maintained this really calm, even stoic demeanor.
Even when things were falling apart around him.
Even then, he knew that by appearing calm and in control, he could inspire confidence in his troops and project an image of strength to his enemies.
Wow, it's like he was using nonverbal communication as a tool to manage not only his own emotions, but also how other people perceived him.
Exactly. And this leads us to another really important part of understanding human nature, the unspoken language of nonverbal cues.
Okay, body language.
Yeah, all of that. The book argues that our body language, our facial expressions, even our tone of voice, can actually reveal more about our true feelings than our words can.
It's like that saying, actions speak louder than words.
Right. It's like everyone is wearing a mask, consciously or not. And we need to learn how to see past that.
It reminds me of that Shakespeare quote, all the world's a stage.
Exactly. We're all putting on a performance, right?
Hmm.
Sending out subtle signals with our posture, our eye contact, even the way we use our hands when we talk.
It's true. I've definitely caught myself mirroring someone's body language without even realizing it, like crossing my arms when they do. It's like a subconscious reflex.
Exactly. It's mostly unconscious,
Yeah.
but it's a powerful tool for building rapport. When we subtly mirror someone's body language, it creates this sense of connection.
That's so interesting. So it's like we're sending these secret signals back and forth without even realizing it. And learning to read those signals can really give us an edge in our interactions.
Absolutely. But it's not just about mirroring, right? The book also goes into these different personality types.
Oh, yeah. It talks about those courtiers we often encounter.
Right. Especially in the workplace.
It's true. Every workplace has its cast of characters. It's like its own little society with its own rules and power dynamics.
Right. Like the intriguer, always scheming and maneuvering for power. And then there's the stiffer, who's resistant to any kind of change, clinging to the old ways of doing things.
Oh, yeah, the stiffer. We've all worked with the stiffer at some point.
Right. And then you've got the gatekeepers, fiercely protective of their information and their domain. And let's not forget about the shadow enabler lurking in the background, subtly manipulating events to their advantage.
It's like a real-life Game of Thrones. But it's not about labeling people, is it? It's more about understanding what motivates them.
You got it. It's about recognizing these patterns of behavior so we can navigate these complex situations more effectively. It's like having a secret decoder ring for human behavior.
I like that, a decoder ring. Speaking of decoding, the book also talks about envy, right? And how it's often misunderstood.
It does. And it's not just about wanting what someone else has. It
Mm.
goes much deeper than that.
So it's not just about material possessions, it's more about how those possessions make us feel.
Exactly. It's often rooted in the sense of inadequacy, like
Mm.
we're not good enough,
Mm.
or that someone else's success is somehow threatening our own status or self-worth.
Oh, I totally get that. It's like when we see someone excelling in an area where we feel insecure and it triggers all those feelings of self-doubt.
Precisely. And the book points out how envy can manifest in these really subtle ways, like those backhanded compliments or that tone of voice that conveys disapproval disguised as praise.
Ugh, those backhanded compliments are the worst. It's like a verbal poison dart.
Right.
So how do we deal with envy, both in ourselves and when we see it in others?
Right.
Because let's be real, we've all felt those pangs of envy at some point in our lives.
Absolutely. We're all human. The first step is just acknowledging those feelings without judgment.
Mhm.
Often just recognizing them can take away their power. And then we can try to channel that energy into something more positive.
So instead of letting envy eat away at us, we can actually use it as fuel for our own growth and development.
I like that. Turning that negative energy into something constructive. That's a really good point. It's so easy to get caught up in comparing ourselves to others, especially these days with social media constantly in our faces.
Yeah.
And, that actually reminds me of something else the book talks about, these generational personalities.
Oh, yeah. That's where it gets into how, like, the events and trends we experience in our lifetimes, especially when we're younger,
Right.
It shapes our values, our perspectives, even our destinies. you could say.
Exactly. It's like each generation develops its own kind of collective personality based on what they've lived through.
Yeah. Like, think about the folks who grew up during the Great Depression. They probably have a very different outlook on life compared to, say, someone who grew up during a time of economic boom. That's so true. My grandparents always emphasized saving and being frugal, which makes sense considering they lived through the Depression. But then my parents, who grew up in a more stable economic time, they're a little more, well, let's just say they're not quite as careful with their money.
Right. It's fascinating how those historical events can have such a lasting impact. But it's not just the big stuff, right? Even those smaller cultural shifts can shape a generation.
Oh, totally. Like, think about the rise of technology. Kids today who've grown up with smartphones and social media, their whole experience of the world is so different from those of us who remember a time before the internet.
Right. It affects how we communicate, how we form relationships, how we see ourselves even. It's huge.
It's like each generation has its own unique set of strengths and weaknesses shaped by the times they grew up in. It's really quite fascinating.
It is, but I think what's really important is that we don't let these generational labels become these rigid boxes. It's
Right.
important to recognize those patterns, but we can't forget that we're all individuals at the end of the day.
Absolutely. We're all shaped by so many different factors. But at the end of the day, there's a common thread that connects us all, right? This shared human experience.
Exactly. We all grapple with the same big questions. What's our purpose in life? What does it all mean?
Exactly. And speaking of big questions, the book also spends some time talking about death,
Yeah, it does.
which might seem like a bit of a downer, but it actually makes a really interesting point.
It does. It argues that acknowledging our own mortality can actually make our lives richer and more meaningful.
Right. It's like by facing that ultimate unknown, it helps us appreciate the present moment even more.
Exactly. It puts things in perspective.
Yeah.
Suddenly those little annoyances don't seem so important anymore.
It's so true. And the book actually uses a great example. It talks about the writer Flannery O'Connor,
Oh, yeah.
who was diagnosed with a terminal illness when she was really young.
Right.
And instead of falling into despair, she used that awareness of her limited time to really fuel her creativity. Her writing became even more profound.
Wow. That's powerful. It really speaks to that human resilience. You know, even when faced with incredibly difficult circumstances, we still have the power to choose how we respond.
That's such an important message. It's not about ignoring the hard stuff. It's about facing it head on and finding a way to make meaning out of it.
Exactly. And that ties into another key idea from the book, this pursuit of a meaningful life.
So it's not just about understanding human nature for the sake of it.
Right.
It's about using that knowledge to actually improve our lives, to find more fulfillment.
Absolutely. It's about asking ourselves, what truly motivates us? What impact do we want to have on the world? What legacy will we leave behind? These are big questions, but they're important ones.
They really are. And sometimes it takes a little deep dive into human nature to even begin to answer them.
Well said. Well said. So there you have it, everyone. Your deep dive into the laws of human nature. We've covered a lot of ground today, from those hidden forces driving our behavior to the power of nonverbal cues, those tricky personality types, and even the importance of embracing our mortality.
We've explored how understanding these aspects of human nature can not only help us navigate our relationships and interactions more effectively, but also lead us to live more fulfilling and meaningful lives. And, this is just scratching the surface.
It is. The book goes into so much more detail, providing all sorts of practical strategies and examples.
Exactly. So if you're ready to really unlock the secrets of human nature, The Laws of Human Nature is definitely worth checking out.
It's a fascinating read for sure.
It is. And on that note, we'll wrap things up here. But before we go, we want to leave you with something to ponder. The book talks about the importance of understanding the spirit of our times, that feeling that defines a particular era. So what do you think defines this moment in history? What are those defining forces that are shaping your generation's path forward? Think on that. And until next time.